On 30 June 1960, as he sat listening to King Baudouin of Belgium deliver his address to the assembled dignitaries in Léopoldville on the Congo's Independence Day, the new Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, became increasingly agitated, scribbling notes furiously. The king's speech was full of patronizing remarks. Without showing any form of remorse, King Baudouin praised Belgium's colonial record, singling out the contribution made by his great-uncle Léopold II. In his speech, the king unashamedly declared, "The independence of the Congo is the crowning of the work conceived by the genius of King Léopold II, undertaken by him with firm courage, and continued by Belgium with perseverance." Having been excluded from the official program, Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba rose to deliver a tirade against Belgium, denouncing at length the terrible suffering and exploitation that the Congolese people had experienced under Belgian colonial rule. Lumumba's speech was warmly applauded by the Congolese present, but the Belgians were outraged and King Baudouin was not amused. In delivering this speech, Patrice Lumumba merely confirmed the suspicions of the Belgian government that he was an enemy of Belgian interests in the region. Just 6 months later, Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned and tragically murdered aged only 35. This is the story of Patrice Lumumba, an African hero and Congo's first prime minister whose reputation inspired hope for independence throughout Africa in the 20th century. A tall, thin man with lots of charisma and great oratory powers, but a volatile temperament, Patrice Emery Lumumba was born in Kasai province in the Congo in 1925. The young boy began attending missionary schools at age 11. Most missionary schools' primary objective was to prepare Africans for manual labor, and only 1 hour per day was given to actual study, with the rest dedicated to farming and other physical work. But Patrice Lumumba was different. His teachers at the missionary responded to his deep desire for knowledge and his inquisitive nature by lending him books to read before dark, as his family was too poor to afford a candle for him to read by. Patrice Lumumba was known for being a vocal, precocious young man, and his outspoken nature would come to define his life and career. Growing up, the young Lumumba was told about the horrific tales of atrocities committed in the Congo at the hands of Belgian soldiers under King Léopold II. King Léopold II had ruled the territory as his fiefdom, and he employed the explorer Henry Morton Stanley as his agent. Léopold II exploited the Congo with such ruthless brutality that, following the revelations of endless mutilations and other atrocities, the Belgian parliament finally, in the year 1908, deprived him of control and turned his territory into a colony. Anyways, Patrice Lumumba left school at age 18, and it has been suggested that it was because his father could no longer afford school fees. After leaving school, he went in search of work, first to Kindu, a mining town, then to Kalima, where he worked as a nursing assistant. In 1944, Patrice Lumumba set out for Kasai's second largest city, Stanleyville, now Kisangani. In this big city, Lumumba was dazzled by the cosmopolitan and European areas, its wide boulevards, swimming pools, skyscrapers, and luxurious villas. However, the city's restaurants, theaters, and hotels were off limits to Africans who were relegated to the back seats of buses and boats and were not permitted to live within city limits. While Lumumba was unable to take advantage of many of the city's amenities, he was able to use the township library in Mongobo where he lived. Lumumba took a course to improve his French and learned several Congolese languages, including Swahili, as well as the Lingala language. In 1947, because he was fluent in Congolese languages, Patrice Lumumba got a job as a postal worker in the capital city of Léopoldville, nearly 1,000 miles down the Congo River, but he was transferred back to Stanleyville in 1950. Back in Stanleyville, Lumumba surrounded himself with Congolese intellectuals. Together, this group of intellectuals debated issues, listened to the news on the radio, and exchanged books. In the early 1950s, Lumumba began expressing himself in editorials and poems he wrote for Voice of the Congo and La Croix du Congo, two Evolue publications. The Evolue were the upper strata of the middle class, the highest level indigenous Congolese could attain in the Belgian colony. Through these writings, Patrice Lumumba became known as one of only a dozen Congolese in a country of 13 million who dared to express himself. Patrice Lumumba became an Evolue in 1954 at a time when he believed in Western values and had not yet become critical of Belgian colonialism. In 1955, when King Baudouin of Belgium and his minister for the colonies visited the Congo, Lumumba's prestige rose when he had talks with them. The king drew Patrice Lumumba aside to discuss the future of the Congo. However, his newly found status made him bitter enemies among both the Belgian administrators and some locals in the Congo. As a result, from 1956 onwards, the colonial administration kept him under constant surveillance. In 1956, the young Lumumba was invited by the government to visit Belgium for a study tour, but on his return to the Congo, was arrested on charges of embezzlement. This alleged embezzlement of funds had taken place when he worked in the post office. There is a general belief, however, that these charges against Patrice were trumped up. The authorities were determined to get him out of the way, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Fortunately, the Minister of the Colonies reduced his sentence to 1 year. Patrice Lumumba's term in prison served only to enhance his reputation in the eyes of the nationalists. While in prison, Lumumba considered his status as an evilware and made a radical shift towards Pan-Africanism and Congolese nationalism. The notion of nationalism enabled different ethnic groups that made up the Congolese society to come together and fight against colonial economic exploitation, political repression, and cultural oppression. Upon his release, Patrice Lumumba moved to the capital, Léopoldville, where he worked as a salesman for a local brewery. Political activity in Léopoldville at the time was beginning to stir. News of Ghana's independence in 1957 and the growing momentum in neighboring French colonies towards African rule provided a new stimulus for the people in the Congo to fight colonialism. The first organized movement came from a tribal organization called Abako. Abako was originally founded by Bakongo leaders to promote use of the Kikongo language, but the organization now began to make overt political demands. Abako's leader, Joseph Kasavubu, set his sights on reuniting the Bakongo people divided by the boundaries of the Belgian Congo, the French Congo, and Angola. Joseph Kasavubu also sought to rebuild the old Congo kingdom that had last flourished in the 16th century. Abako established a strong political base among the Bakongo living in Léopoldville and the Lower Congo region. Another party later appeared, and it was called Konakat. The party was led by Moise Chombe, a shrewd politician who was the son of a wealthy businessman from Katanga. Konakat favored provincial autonomy for Katanga and worked closely with Belgian groups pursuing the same interests, and also advocated continuing ties with Belgium. Patrice Lumumba chose a different path. In 1958, he joined a group of other young evilwares to launch the Congolese national movement, the MNC, to rally support on a national basis. Only Lumumba's MNC stood out as a champion of Congolese nationalism. It was the first all-Congolese political party based not on ethnicity or based on region, but for the entire country. One very important encounter for Lumumba was when, along with 2 companions, he was allowed to travel to Accra, Ghana in December of 1958 to attend the All-African People's Conference. At the conference, Patrice had the privilege to address the crowd gathered. As a number of other African nationalists pushing for political independence listened, Lumumba declared, "The winds of freedom currently blowing across all of Africa have not left the Congolese people indifferent. Political awareness, which until very recently was latent, is now becoming manifest and assuming outward expression, and it will assert itself even more forcefully in the months to come. We are thus assured of the support of the masses and of the success of the efforts we are undertaking." Like other delegates that were present at the conference, Patrice Lumumba returned home burning with enthusiasm for the struggle against colonial rule and determined to build the MNC into a mass political movement along the lines of Kwame Nkrumah's CPP. Patrice Lumumba was now hell-bent on fighting for Congolese independence. In January of 1959, the city of Léopoldville was torn by vicious rioting. The immediate cause of the violence was a decision by the local authorities to refuse permission for Kasavubu's Abako to hold a scheduled Sunday afternoon meeting. But further investigations by the Belgians revealed that unemployment, overcrowding, and discrimination had produced a groundswell of frustration and discontent amongst the masses. And so, to help quell the discontent, the Belgian government announced a program of political reform, starting with local government elections. The colonial government also added a vague promise about independence as being the eventual goal of Belgian policy. However, many people felt that these reforms were not enough. More radical nationalists denounced these plans as being too slow and called for a boycott of the proposed municipal and rural elections. Well, the Belgians did not take this lying down, and their repression followed. Belgian repression peaked on 30 October 1959, when the forcible dispersion of an MNC rally in Stanleyville led to the death of 30 people. Thereafter, Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned on a charge of inciting riots. Following all of this, Congo descended into chaos. There was disorder and violence in other key areas of the country, and the Belgian authorities found it difficult to suppress. Over the next few months, the Congolese felt empowered to resist. They tested the Belgian administrators, daring them to punish the colonized people. In the Lower Congo, the Bakongo refused to pay taxes and to abide by the administrative regulations. More disturbances occurred in Stanleyville, and when King Baudouin visited the city in December of 1959, the mob of demonstrators that greeted him at the airport had to be dispersed with tear gas. Pressure was increasingly piling on Belgium, and so it felt obliged to hasten the process of independence for the Congo. A conference was convened for all Congolese political parties, and they were to meet in Brussels in January of 1960. Lumumba's MNC refused to take part without him being present, and it was soon obvious to the Belgians that the conference would not succeed without Lumumba being there. And so Patrice Lumumba was released from prison, and he arrived in Brussels on 26 January 1960. At the conference, only Patrice Lumumba insisted upon a single Congo, while Moise Tshombe, whose power base was the mineral-rich Katanga province, proposed an independent Congo made up of a loose federation of semi-autonomous provinces. At this conference, provincial and national elections were set for May of 1960, with Congo eventually gaining independence in June of that year. The elections themselves were a true testament of how divided the Congo was. Of the 137 seats that were up for grabs on the National Assembly, the PSA party won 13 seats, Kasavubu's Abako with 12 seats, Konakat with 8, and Lumumba's MNC with a majority of 33 seats. The rest of the seats went to over a dozen smaller parties. Lumumba tried unsuccessfully to unite with Tshombe's Konakat, as did Kasavubu. Finally, on 23 June 1960, Patrice Lumumba and Joseph Kasavubu allied to form a unified government of Congo, with Kasavubu as president and Lumumba as prime minister. On Independence Day, attended by the King of the Belgians, King Baudouin, the new Prime Minister, Lumumba, considered himself and the Congolese people as being utterly disrespected when he was not scheduled to speak at the formal ceremony handing over power on 30 June 1960. Following the patronizing speech by King Baudouin that I alluded to earlier, in which he praised Belgium's great civilizing mission in the Congo, Lumumba defied protocol and made a radical speech in reply, in which he castigated the brutality and injustice of Belgian rule in the Congo. In his independence speech, Lumumba also said, and I quote, "We are going to show the world what the black man can do when he works in freedom, and we are going to make of the Congo the center of the sun's radiance for all of Africa. We are going to keep watch over the lands of our country so that they truly profit her children." The official lunch which followed the ceremony was delayed for 2 hours, while King Baudouin and his ministers debated whether to boycott it and fly back at once to Belgium. When the lunch eventually took place, it was cold and disorganized. The country that Lumumba and Kasavubu inherited was by any standard ill-prepared for independence. Except at a local level, no Congolese had acquired any experience of government or parliamentary life. In the top ranks of the civil servants, no more than 3 Congolese out of an establishment of 1,400 held posts, and 2 of those had been recently appointed. Moreover, prior to the handover of government authorities, the Belgians had produced a new constitution that assigned to 6 provincial governments the same competencies as those of the central government. This arrangement was an invitation for an immediate power struggle between the provinces and the central government. And for sure, such a power struggle duly erupted within days of the country's independence. The honeymoon for Congo and for Patrice Lumumba, if he even had any, was short-lived. It was only a few days after independence before the first disaster struck. Here, among the ranks of the Force Publique, the Congo's army, resentment over low pay and lack of promotion had been simmering for months. The soldiers contrasted their own dire living conditions and bleak prospects with the sudden wealth and influence of civilian politicians, former clerks and salesmen, who were now driving around in large cars and spending money freely. The members of the Force Publique were also not happy with the slow rate of Africanization or lack thereof that was taking place in this army. While the government was run by Congolese, the army remained under the control of the same 1,100 strong Belgian officers. The command of the Force Publique, General Emile Janssens, only made this situation worse. The general was adamant that there would be no acceleration in the Africanization program. After an incident of indiscipline at an army barrack in Léopoldville on 4 June, General Janssens summoned officers and men on duty at army headquarters and lectured them on the need for absolute obedience. To make his point clear, he wrote on a blackboard the following words: "Before independence is equal to after independence." In response, the soldiers held a protest meeting in the army camp that night, demanding the dismissal of General Janssens. This ended up in a riot. Troops at another garrison were ordered to intervene, but they mutinied and went on a rampage, attacking European civilians. Congo was in crisis. Prime Minister Lumumba had to act, and he publicly accused Belgian officers of fomenting rebellion. He then dismissed General Janssens and other senior officers. In subsequent negotiations with the army, Lumumba decided that the entire officer corps should be replaced by Congolese. Prime Minister Lumumba also appointed Victor Lundula as the new army commander, and as chief of staff, Lumumba chose his trusted personal aide, one Joseph Mobutu, who had spent 7 years in the Force Publique working mainly as a clerk, rising to the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest rank open to Congolese. Amid this whole chaos, thousands of Europeans, primarily Belgians, fled, and stories of atrocities against white people surfaced in newspapers around the globe.
Streaming into the little town of Kitwe in northern Rhodesia, just across the border from the Congo, come the refugees, with whatever they could bring, and often bearing marks of the trouble they had getting away. Further north, at the frontier post of Kasumbalesa, families arrive by car and on foot, and even the children are armed.
The great mineral wealth of the Congo meant that a number of Western nations, including the former colonial power Belgium, Britain and France, as well as the United States with the principal motive of Cold War strategy, were not prepared to lose these vast resources, and so they had to act fast. The Belgian government at first tried to persuade Lumumba to permit Belgian troops stationed in the Congo to restore order. But when Lumumba refused, the Belgians unilaterally ordered their forces into action and arranged to fly in reinforcements. As their troops took control of key points like Léopoldville Airport, Patrice Lumumba became convinced that Belgium was trying to reimpose its rule. Well, on 11 June 1960, the crisis escalated even further. With the connivance of Belgium and support of Belgian mining and commercial firms, the Katanga leader Moise Tshombe grasped the opportunity of the chaos to declare Katanga an independent state. Belgian troops were used to disarm and expel Congolese army units from the province. The main purpose of this mission and arrangement was to insulate the province from the disorder and apparent militant nationalism sweeping the rest of the Congo, as well as to safeguard the Western investment there. The Belgians were also intent on using Katanga as a base from which to establish a pro-Belgian government in Léopoldville. Desperate for help, Patrice Lumumba appealed to the United Nations to help restore order and maintain the integrity of the Congo by preventing Katanga's secession. The United Nations also faced a formidable task, and although it acted swiftly, it was unable to prevent the immediate cessation of Katanga. In an increasingly volatile mood, Patrice Lumumba demanded that the United Nations force be used to expel the Belgian troops. Lumumba issued an ultimatum threatening that if the United Nations did not remove all Belgian troops from the Congo by midnight on 19 July, then he would invite the Soviet Union to intervene. Now, you have to understand that this was at a time when the Cold War rivalry was at one of its peaks. And so Lumumba's threats infuriated the United States and pushed the Congo into the middle of a Cold War confrontation. United States officials feared the possibility of a communist takeover in Congo similar to Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution in 1959. They feared that this would provide the Soviet Union with a base in the heart of Africa. Lumumba's nationalism was seen by the West as a threat to its strategic interests in the region, not least because of the country's enormous mineral wealth encompassing as it did copper, diamonds, rubber, uranium and cobalt. In 1958, the Congo produced 50% of the world's supply of uranium, most of which was purchased by the United States. It also produced 75% of the world's cobalt and 70% of its industrial diamonds. Belgian troops were eventually withdrawn from the Congo, but Lumumba issued new demands, insisting that the United Nations troops be used to end the cessation of Katanga by force if necessary. When United Nations officials made clear to him that their mandate did not include interfering in the Congo's internal conflicts and that they wanted a negotiated settlement in Katanga, Lumumba reacted in fury, accusing the United Nations of collaboration with Belgium. Key UN officials came to share the United States and the Belgian view that Lumumba was too erratic and irrational to be trusted. On 15 August, seeing the need for military victory in Katanga and facing another cessation in South Kasai, the main source of Congo's diamond riches, Lumumba took the fateful decision to ask the Soviet Union for immediate military assistance. With the support of the Soviet aircraft, trucks, crews and technicians, Lumumba planned to send a military force first to regain control in South Kasai and then to march on Elizabethville in Katanga to overthrow Moise Tshombe. At a meeting of the United States National Security Council 3 days later, President Eisenhower, when told by his advisors that Lumumba might succeed in forcing the United Nations to leave the Congo, authorized his CIA to eliminate Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba's military expedition to Kasai, meanwhile, resulted in the massacre of hundreds of Baluba tribesmen and the flight of 250,000 refugees. News of these atrocities in Kasai added to the alarm spreading among Lumumba's growing band of critics and opponents. Colonel Mobutu, now the army's chief of staff, fell out with Lumumba over the expedition and joined the ranks of his critics. As moves to oust Lumumba gathered momentum, the focus of attention turned to President Joseph Kasavubu. In a radio broadcast on 5 September 1960, President Joseph Kasavubu accused Patrice Lumumba of governing arbitrarily and plunging the Congo into civil war. He then announced that he had revoked his appointment as Prime Minister and appointed Joseph Ileyo, a widely respected moderate, in his place. Lumumba, however, was not so easily defeated. Upon hearing the news, he rushed to the radio station to make an announcement of his own. Lumumba announced that he had dismissed Joseph Kasavubu as president, accusing him of treason. The outcome of this whole fiasco was ultimately decided on the 14th of September. With the active encouragement of the United States CIA and the connivance of some United Nations official, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, the 29-year-old Army Chief of Staff who controlled the troops in Léopoldville, stepped forward and declared that he was neutralizing all politicians until the end of the year 1960. Colonel Mobutu assumed power himself and he then ordered the expulsion of all Russian and Czech personnel. The CIA station chief in the Congo, Lawrence Devlin, developed a particularly close relationship with Colonel Mobutu, providing him with funds to secure the loyalty of his troops. Now, in order to deal with issues of legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, Colonel Mobutu formed an interim government, retaining Joseph Kasavubu as president, but excluding all of Lumumba's supporters. Meanwhile, in October of 1960, Patrice Lumumba was placed under house arrest in Léopoldville. Lumumba continued to live at the Prime Minister's residence, a mansion situated on a bluff overlooking the Congo River, guarded by an inner ring of United Nations troops in the garden to prevent his arrest. Lumumba's house was also surrounded by an outer ring of Mobutu soldiers on the perimeter to prevent his escape. The CIA, meanwhile, fearing that Lumumba might return to power, continued working on his assassination schemes. At a meeting of the US National Security Council on 21 September, the chief of the CIA stressed that Lumumba remained a grave danger as long as he was not disposed of. With this in mind, a senior CIA scientist, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, put together an assassination kit that included a poison designed to produce a disease indigenous to that area of Africa that could be fatal. But this poison reached its expiry date before Lawrence Devlin had worked out a scheme to infiltrate Lumumba's residence. The Belgians were also working on their own assassination schemes. United Nations officials in Léopoldville, well aware of how perilous and precarious Lumumba's position was, continued to warn him that they would only be able to provide him with protection if he remained in his residence. Now, when the United Nations General Assembly, under intensive American pressure, voted to recognize Kasavubu and Mobutu as the legitimate occupiers of the Congolese seat in the UN General Assembly, Patrice Lumumba knew that his time was running out, and so he tried to make a plan. On 25 November 1960, during a heavy tropical downpour, hidden in the back of a car, Patrice Lumumba secretly left the safety of his residence and set out to drum up support in the rest of the country on his way to his personal power base in Stanleyville. The United Nations force, which was not allowed to interfere in internal Congolese politics, was ordered neither to assist nor to interfere with Lumumba's progress or with the movements of his pursuers. Lumumba's decision to leave his residence turned out to be a fatal one. Colonel Mobutu's soldiers caught up with him at Mweka in the vast territory of Kasai.
Patrice Lumumba comes back to Léopoldville a prisoner. The former Congo premier, who was captured when he fled inland, no longer wears the tuft of whiskers on his chin that helped to identify him. His arrest provoked several clashes between Lumumba followers and Congolese army troops.
Patrice Lumumba was imprisoned in the military camp at Thysville, halfway between Léopoldville and the Atlantic. Even in captivity, Lumumba's undoubted charisma made Joseph Kasavubu and Colonel Mobutu, and perhaps also the United States and Belgium, very worried. They were concerned that the soldiers in Thysville were sympathetic to him. While the United Nations Secretary General and his representatives demanded Lumumba's release, Joseph Kasavubu and Colonel Mobutu, with the help of their Belgian mentors, searched for a way to get rid of him for good. They came up with an essentially simple plan to hand him over to the Luba people of Kasai. The Luba wanted revenge for Lumumba's forces' disastrous foray into Kasai, which resulted in the deaths of many Luba people. The idea was to land Lumumba at Bakwanga in Kasai and let the Luba people do the rest. But at the last minute, the plotters found that the United Nations troops were in charge of the Bakwanga airfield. And so Patrice Lumumba and his two companions, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, were redirected to Elizabethville in Katanga. President Joseph Kasavubu telephoned the Katanga secessionist leader Moise Chombe to tell him that 3 parcels were on the way and that he would know what to do with them. On the aircraft, the specially picked Luba guards worked over their hated enemy with immense brutality. After landing at Elizabethville, the plane was directed to a remote corner of the airfield. At an isolated house in the bush, Katanga ministers and some Belgians subjected what was left of Lumumba to further beatings. The 3 men were then driven to a remote area, executed and buried in shallow graves. The next day, the bodies were exhumed, cut up and dissolved in sulfuric acid. No identifiable trace of Lumumba and his companions remained. Patrice Lumumba was only 35 years old. It was only in June of 2022 that a tooth that had once belonged to Patrice Lumumba was returned to the now Democratic Republic of the Congo from Belgium. The announcement nearly a month later by Katanga's Minister of Interior that Lumumba had escaped and had been caught and killed by the people of a loyal village was universally disbelieved. This announcement triggered a violent worldwide reaction. Belgian and American embassies were attacked, and there was a riot in the spectators' gallery of the United Nations Security Council. Following his death, Patrice Lumumba became a national and African hero. To this day, especially for oppressed people, Lumumba stands as a martyr to colonialism and as a symbol for the fight against Western capitalism and greed. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.